Okay. All right. So talking about China 2022 to 2023 behind the headlines. And I'm just going to highlight four main things we'll talk about tonight. One of them being the tumultuous end to zero COVID, and then problems or the growing serious problems in the Chinese economy, society, and perhaps in politics. There are challenges to Xi Jinping's vision of China's future. Whether those challenges translate into challenges to his power remains to be seen, but his power is arguably in the weakest position it's been in at least 5 years, if not longer. Meanwhile, Xi is moving China to champion sorry, I skipped that too fast, the global South, and use this to try to leverage change against the global West, particularly the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, other established democracies. Whether that works or not remains to be seen, but it's clearly the focus of Chinese attention right now, and it speaks to Xi's lack of attendance at things like the G20 or the APEC meeting recently. The ASEAN meeting recently, and the open question about whether he comes to the leaders' meeting for the APEC meeting in San Francisco later this fall. So with that, I'll go into these in somewhat more detail. Okay. So the end of COVID. So this China, as I trust we all recall, was carrying out a policy of zero COVID, which meant that as soon as a case was discovered in a locality, wide neighborhoods were locked down, people forced to basically stay in their apartments. There was an immense testing regime as part of trying to prevent the outbreak of COVID. And very intrusive kinds of efforts to monitor the spread of disease and monitor people's health, segregate certain parts of cities. You had to have a pass on your phone that said you had tested recently and were safe like a day or two. Massive numbers of people were employed with this as part of the testing regime. And as you might imagine, this meant that China was producing fantastic amounts of personal protective equipment, not just masks and shields, but also those sort of airproof type of hazardous materials, clothing that people would tear off and dispose of at the end of the day. Despite all that, and despite in the spring of 2022, Shanghai, the largest city and perhaps the largest economic center in China, being closed down for 2 months, the Omicron variant of COVID spread in China, and more of China was being put under lockdown. And you may have heard about this last week. This led in November to a fire in Urumqi, Xinjiang, where because of the barriers, because of the testing, the fire department was not able to get to a high rise in Urumqi. And at least by Chinese press accounts, 10 people died. And this drew people's outrage. More and more threats of lockdown and more parts of the country led to more and more protests. So after Omicron is becoming endemic in China, there were large-scale, widespread protests in Chinese cities beginning in November 2022. They were focusing on zero COVID, but there were also political elements. So in this picture here, you can see large numbers of people holding up white or blank sheets of paper And this is a sign that they acknowledge that that the news and everything else in China is censored. And they're saying, you know, we understand that you're not telling us the truth. And we want there to be more written and freedom of press and more information and so on. They may also be holding it up so that the ever-present photo surveillance doesn't get all their pictures all that clearly. And you can see people are wearing masks, both for public health reasons, but also, again, so it's harder to identify them on public security cameras. There were even calls in Shanghai in some of these protests for Xi Jinping to step down. So the Chinese party state, not so long after these protests began to bubble up, effectively abandoned zero COVID. They didn't formally announce it, but basically they began to take down the barriers. They began to stop testing. The monitors began to disappear. You could travel around more freely. And so the zero COVID regimen just disappeared within a matter of several weeks. But while it did that, while that happened, the party state made no attempt to ensure that vulnerable populations were inoculated or that their inoculations were up to date. They didn't stock up with materials. They didn't provide forewarning to hospitals that there would be more cases. They didn't buy Paxlovid in large numbers, all of which suggested that they basically were going to allow the disease to run its course. And it appears between 1.6 to 2 million people died between November 2022 and February 2023 because of COVID. And to repeat something I'll say in different ways in later slides, China has not provided official figures. Demographers are beginning to piece together the preliminary census and other materials of populations that are beginning to make rounded judgments about how many people died. Large numbers of the elderly in particular died, vulnerable people, particularly in cities and in rural areas. So this ending of zero COVID had a number of legacies. One of which was that one could say that protest appeared to work. So there were more than 100 protest events in November, in December, and January 2023. This chart here covers the period from May to November 22nd, 2022. It's from the Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor. I tried to get the more recent picture, but it wouldn't download for me. But if you are interested in reports of protests in China, go to Freedom House's website, look for the China Dissent Monitor, and you can plug in particular dates that you want to search for and so on. These are probably a tip of the iceberg. These are the ones that we hear about in the West. There are probably many more, but they give you a sense of where protest is taking place in China. Because of the legacy of zero COVID, the shutting down of Shanghai for 2 months in 2022, the possibility that the party state might bring it back, also the effect of US-China tensions, there's begun to be a partial relocation of global supply chains, meaning that China's export engine is being reduced to a degree, that investment in Vietnam, in India, in Bangladesh, Southeast Asia, and so on is supplementing production that used to be solely dependent on the PRC. So companies are now saying they have a China plus policy now rather than solely relying on China. And it looks like some are beginning to think about leaving China, although that remains to be seen. But the picture is China is a harder and harder place to do business, partly for political reasons, international reasons, but partly because the Chinese government acts and there's no consideration of others' interests. As I've already noted, many of the dead are the elderly. So there were questions about why the party state didn't prepare for the end of COVID to protect its most vulnerable. This challenges the claims the party makes of being competent, of technocratic, of being out to preserve the people's interests, to look out for the people. And that was a fundamental, or that is a fundamental claim for its claims to the right to rule or its legitimacy. This is not to say that that there have been fundamental challenges to the party, but that certainly there's whispering going on. There is criticism among friends about how this was handled and so on. Moreover, this affects China's claims it makes internationally as well. They portrayed how well China was doing under zero COVID and how this hadn't led to widespread death and dislocation, or so they said, with what happened in the United States or in England or other Western countries where the disease was not as easily and effectively contained, but where societies made the transition to life in a new normal as COVID became more than a flu-like outbreak, but nonetheless something that was normalized as part of the risks that society absorbs as part of daily life. So this claim that China had superior performance doesn't look so much better now, so that they're not able to make this kind of claim as much. China has now developed its own mRNA vaccines, like Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna, but it has yet to develop its equivalent to Paxlovid, the treatment. Indeed, it has, in contrast to the mRNA vaccines of the West, which China didn't license, it did license Paxlovid from Pfizer, BioNTech. So that's available, but we don't know how much China has built. It has made, and it's not reporting on the state of COVID these days. But the legacy, one of the legacies of COVID has been to recommit to becoming a world leader in biotechnology. Okay. And finally, and again, to the point I made a minute ago, China seems ever more committed to hiding bad news and not sharing information that China looks bad. So they stopped reporting youth unemployment figures. They stopped reporting some of the figures for the economy that weren't showing things going perfectly. So this all leads into people reading into it, outside analysts trying to read into this. And so, if they don't report something, it means things are bad when something should normally have been reported. So it's not clear what they're actually doing by obstructing or not revealing the degree of badness, as opposed to people then inventing different kinds of scenarios or rumors about how bad it is. Okay, moving on to economic and social problems. So China's like everywhere else where economic issues and societal issues are closely intertwined. It's people who make the economy run. They produce things, they buy things, they invest, they save, and so on. And that affects both how the economy works and, of course, how people feel in society, their sense of wherewithal, their sort of, for some, a sense of meaning in things that they own, et cetera, et cetera. When I hurriedly look back at my presentation for last year, I listed many of the same things in last year's presentation for 2021, 2022. The only difference now is that things appear worse than they were a year ago. These problems that the Chinese economy and society are facing are both of an objective nature, the slowing of growth, high youth unemployment, growing debt, et cetera, and of a subjective nature, about the growing perception of limited opportunities, of unfairness, unhappiness, alienation, and the behavioral consequences of these feelings. If you're alienated, you might not manifest too many things externally or in actions with others, but you withdraw some of your commitment to your work or your the way you relate to friends and so on. You aren't as productive, you aren't as happy, you may be suffering from minor psychological distress and so on. And there's plenty of manifestation of these in Chinese society. There's also, and I'll say more about this in the political section, that people just are fed up with the degree of control the party is exercising over their lives and so on. Okay. So economic problems at the high point, or at the sort of focal point for the economic problems, is the property sector. So many property sector or developers in China are in dire financial shape, especially Evergrande and Country Gardens. So this is a picture of the Country Gardens headquarters in Guangzhou. And they've sort of taken, putting plants on your roof to extreme here to get at this. We're going to build apartments and buildings that combine the country and the garden aspect of it. Overall, more than 50 property firms in China, most of which are privately owned, have delayed or defaulted on bond payments. It looks like Evergrande is going to be shut down. That they seem to be unable to work their way out of things. So why is this a problem? So property is about 25% of the Chinese economy in terms of buying and selling things, of where inputs go, of consumer spending. Because when you buy an apartment in China, you buy it without the frills. You are responsible for furnishing, but also putting in the detail in the apartments. So if the apartments don't get finished, they don't get built, that's going to be a drag on the economy. Not only that, there are limited options for where ordinary Chinese can put their money. That you can invest in the stock market, but that's not transparent, and it isn't related to enterprise performance, or you cannot have shareholders vote out the CEO for poor performance. So that it's really just sort of a casino type of issue. Historically, Chinese have invested in property as a store of value. It's always been a common source of investment in China, going back centuries, if not millennia. So many people would buy a second or a third or fourth apartment, thinking maybe they would resell it in the future at a profit. So there was excess building in response to this demand, particularly in what are called third-tier cities. So first-tier cities in China are Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Tianjin, Chongqing. Then provincial capitals are second-tier cities, and basically all cities after that are third or fourth tier. And particularly third and fourth tier cities, you can migrate from the countryside, establish residency, and be entitled to urban residence status in those cities. So there's a lot of peasants moving to those cities to gain some access to the limited Chinese welfare system. So lots of speculation went on in those cities. Some speculation went on in second and first tier cities. The property development system works in China by a company saying, we're going to build a new apartment on this piece of land. We'll take your deposits to ensure that you have a place in this brand new building. And they have fancy dioramas and floor plans and all sorts of things they show to people to get them to put 25, 30% down on their apartment. And they use this capital to repay the local authorities who own the land for land use rights, and to start construction. And they expect then the owners of the apartments to be paying their mortgage on these things that are yet to be built. But if the demand slackens, then the money isn't coming in. They borrow to sometimes start financing projects. All of this meant that all of a sudden, lots of construction was stopping in China. People put their money into these new apartments. They didn't get finished. There's lots of anger about the money that they've already spent and the prospect that maybe the building will never get finished. So there have been protests, demands for bailouts for the construction companies or the property companies, and so on. Relatedly, that the major way that local governments financed their local government budgets was to sell land use rights. The state owns the land effectively in China, so no one really owns the land, but the state has the right to sell it to an apartment construction firm for land use rights for 75 or 99 years, which effectively for most people means, lifetime ownership. They, to stimulate their own economies, also invested in property development. And so many local governments in China are now close to being effectively bankrupt. They set up special firms to rival banks to fund these sorts of things. And so they were part of this asset bubble, this speculative bubble that was going on. Some might call it a Ponzi scheme. That was the Chinese property market. Moreover, the central government, like the US government has done in the past, mandates spending at the local level without providing the funding for it. So this has put a real squeeze on many local governments. And this is getting to be a source of great distress too. Okay. So the economy overall is slowing. They're hoping for a 5% rate of growth. Outside observers are perhaps 3.5 to 4, which is quite a come down from what China is used to. Now, some of this is natural, but many more factors are political, international, and so on. So in general, when economies approach technological frontiers, economic growth slows down. You have to put lots of investment in to come up with new products. Some of these investments for new products don't work. China's population growth is, in fact, in reverse. So that means other things equal. The number of consumers is going down. That lowers demand. So that, too, slows things down. So all of this is sort of a natural process. But there are political factors that are making many of these things worse. The Chinese Communist Party, and the party state continue to emphasize investment as opposed to consumption. About 40% of national income goes to investment. This is about double or more than double of the United States. US is on the low side. European countries, somewhere between 20 and 25%. Germany, which is the highest Western country in terms of investment, somewhere between 25 and 30%. But they've built out their infrastructure. There's, China now, according to recent visitors, very clean, very efficient, very well developed in most cities. There's not a lot of place to put all of this investment that would have much of a good rate of return, whether that's immediate return or longer range in building out things like high-speed rail and so on. So as long as they're wedded to this high investment strategy, that's going to pull things down. And the prospects for this paying off in the long term are iffy. There's priority also for high tech and state-owned enterprises. High tech tends to be capital intensive, meaning it doesn't generate lots of jobs. You put your money your banks of computers or servers for AI. You don't need that many people to manage them. You need some, but not as much as in sort of standard assembly line manufacturing. Money is going to the state sector. It's starving the private sector. Many more companies in the private sector. They have a higher rate of productivity. They're less capital intensive. They tend to be more export oriented. And so they're holding back what had been historically the faster growing part of the economy. Moreover, high-tech development usually heightens social and economic inequality, which already is quite high in China. The state discourages consumption or people spending the money in savings. That Chinese people save a lot, partly because there isn't a well-established social security system. They're saving because they have to put down large amounts of money to get a mortgage or an apartment, to buy a car. Consumer credit has developed in China, but it's not as free and easy as it is in the United States. That you can't, again, you have to put down substantial amounts of money before you will be given a loan for an apartment or a car and so on. For life rituals such as marriages or funerals, again, people save a lot. Excuse me. Moreover, the Chinese people are aware that there's stress going on in the economy, that some of the bad news is filtering through, or at least they hear from other people. So when you're hearing that the things are not going well, that makes you less inclined to spend. And finally, Xi Jinping himself has denigrated the idea of a welfare system, sort of in line with conservative thought in the United States and elsewhere. This will just make people lazy. They won't work very hard if you provide too many sort of social welfare functions for them. Moreover, they'd have to divert money from investment into building up Social Security and health insurance funds to cover the population. The banking system is under stress, particularly because it's lent to non-performing housing developers. Moreover, because the banks have had the state try to tighten up on their lending, local governments set up what are called non-bank financial institutions. So these are companies set up by local governments that essentially do banking business, extend loans, sort of on the credit of the local government. And so they've been, they're supposedly backed by local governments. And so their ability to generate credit has not been challenged, at least until recently. The central government is saying, actually, we're not going to back these things if they get into trouble. They'll go bankrupt, which will have spillover effects on the economy, on local government finances, and so on. So there was the expectation that the central leadership or the central state was going to bail them out, which only reinforced their willingness to take risks. This is what economists and others call moral hazard. But now it appears that the central state, is not going to back them. And this has caused great concern among local governments, among the people working in these sectors, and has really stalled credit at the local level. There's little new foreign investment in China, as China seems to be hostile to foreign enterprises and perhaps foreigners. If you don't speak Chinese, it's very difficult to get around in China today because everything is on your phone, on an app. Cash is basically, you can only use it on a taxi from the airport in from Beijing or Shanghai to the central city. After that, cash disappears. Western credit cards generally don't work, or they're limited to where they apply. And unless you have a Chinese bank account, it's very difficult to be able to access the apps that allow you to access the Chinese economy. So the expat community in China is thinning out. This has helped to encourage the redrawing of supply chains to Southeast Asia, South Asia, some in cases in Latin America, and growingly in Africa. Moreover, China has arrested or detained people who engage in what's called due diligence, who for Western investment companies look into the financial conditions, the accounting of firms that you might want to invest in. And so by trying to discover whether this company's books are accurate or not, or whether it's a good potential investment, China is arresting the people undertaking that work, accusing them of spying, of getting secret information. And needless to say, this further discourages foreign investment. And then, of course, the United States and China are still engaged in the trade war. U.S. and Chinese tariffs on each other continue. The U.S. has banned certain technologies related to chips going to China. As this continues, as the political discourse in the United States turns increasingly critical of China, there's a logic to increasing the sectors that we de-link in. So if you've been reading the papers carefully, you might have noticed that Ford Motor Company, which was setting up a big electric vehicle or electronic vehicle production line in Michigan, was partnering with a Chinese firm for its batteries, CATL, which is one of the two biggest battery producers in the world. The other also a Chinese producer of batteries. And this was stopped after Congress members began to raise questions about why you're doing business with China. Where Ford is going to get its batteries isn't entirely clear, but that means that pressure is growing to de-link from China's supply chain for batteries, and China really does control that supply chain to a very substantial extent. So the United States or its allies are going to have to develop these industries at great cost, as opposed to buying the Chinese systems. Okay. But we shouldn't necessarily take, or as some politicians in the US are doing, taking joy in China's current distress. As I just suggested, China is the dominant producer in many industrial fields, including those related to new energy sources, whether it's solar panels, batteries, wind turbines. It's the world's largest producer of electronic vehicles. China is set to start launching exports around the world. The Europeans have banned them, or at least put them under warning. None have yet come into the US, but they're in a position to really challenge US production if the US government allows them to be imported. And they would be much cheaper than US EVs. The Chinese dominate supply chains related to batteries. They own most of the mines for critical minerals. They do most of the refining for these critical minerals. They assemble the batteries and so on. But China's high-tech sector is growing, and lots of state money is being thrown at it to overcome the technological obstacles, with some success, but not a huge amount. But China is concentrating lots of people, lots of money in these sectors. China has been pursuing a policy called civil-military fusion to transfer advanced technology from the civil sector to the military. And the results, at least in terms of Chinese military hardware, according to defense analysts, is quite impressive. So, as I think I mentioned, which I should have if I didn't, that 20% of the 18 to 25-year-olds in China are unemployed. And that, needless to say, is a real challenge. Did I skip this slide? No. That's a real challenge for them, for their parents, and so on. But for those over 25, it's not nearly as bad. And for those who own their apartments and have good salaries, basically a secure position, those people aren't necessarily unhappy if they didn't invest in additional property. So that we're talking about some sectors with great distress, but other sectors not being so unhappy. So here is where I was. I misremembered where I put it in the slide. So in terms of the social ramifications of these economic and other issues, so the youth unemployment of 18 to 25-year-olds is 20%. And they've stopped reporting a breakdown of unemployment by age cohorts. Moreover, there are new large cohorts of college grads and others coming on the job market each year. There's a mismatch between education and occupational needs. There's not a lot of emphasis on, as in the United States, on skills training in things like electricians, plumbing, and so on. Lots of people going on to college with the expectation that they would get a good white-collar job. There's dramatically falling rates of fertility. Total fertility rate for Chinese women now is 1.09, which means that they would have, on average, 1.09 children during their childbearing years. Replacement rate for a population is about 2.1. So China is about half of that. South Korea is about 0.89. Japan, I think, is about 1. And Taiwan is also about 1. So this seems to be a common East Asia phenomenon. It means the populations, if they haven't already done so, are going to start shrinking quite dramatically. The population's aging. The consequence of that aging population is the need for more healthcare, more Social Security, and so on. In other words, China is likely to become old before it becomes rich, as is the case in, for example, Japan or South Korea or much of Western Europe. They lack a good Social Security system. It reinforces the need for lots of savings and an unwillingness to spend to stimulate the economy. And knowing that some people have access to Social Security, that other places have Social Security systems, this leads to grumbling about the political system that doesn't create this kind of Social Security system. The high cost of living, the difficulty of finding good jobs have led increasing numbers of young people to decide not to marry, or if they do marry, to not have children. For many, and particularly in desirable Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, the cost of housing is out of reach for many young people. And the expectation with marriage is that the male spouse would provide a place to live for his wife. But if you can't provide a new apartment, then you were seen as not a good provider, and that sort of pushed you into out of the marriage market, or as they call it, or again, the sort of marrying people that you might have thought were not your equal. And again, this challenges claims to the state's competence and legitimacy. I'm taking too long. Let me see if I can speed this up. So then we have Xi Jinping and political problems. So Xi Jinping is among the most loquacious Chinese leaders, giving speeches all the time, giving his views on everything. His priorities are such that the party should be in charge of everything. And implicit in that is that Xi should be in charge of everything in the party. He backs the dominance of state-owned enterprises, as this is what socialism is, and China is a socialist society. He's a high priest of modernity, of high-tech modernity, a strong backer of it. He sees China being the most technologically advanced society in the world by 2050. He wants China to be more self-reliant in high tech, not to be dependent on chips that are dependent on US technologies. He has denigrated social welfare. He's called for plain living and hard struggle. He's basically said these unemployed youth, 18 to 25, should go off and live in the countryside and seek to find their fortunes there, which, needless to say, doesn't appeal to youths who have grown up in cities, are accustomed to to urban amenities and so on. She sees the West in decline and sees China as the coming power. And there's nothing to indicate that the recent struggles that China is facing are ones that have caused him to rethink. Indeed, it's hard to see many cases where Xi is flexible enough to alter his thinking to move away from some of these set principles that he seems to uphold quite strenuously. He may have been forced to backtrack on zero COVID, on some political appointments that over this summer, the foreign minister, Qin Gang, was fired, ostensibly because he had a child from a woman who was not his wife. The child was born in the US, which meant the child had US citizenship, which for the foreign minister was a no-no. They fired the secretary or China's minister of defense for reasons that are now said to be related to corruption. Two leaders of China's rocket forces or missile forces, which manage China's nuclear weapons as well, were also relieved of duty. So there's sort of rumblings about political issues going on under the surface without a lot of clarity. And he may be forced to backtrack a bit on some economic activity that the Prime Minister Li Qiang has been trying to talk up private sector. Not clear what's happening with that. The Japanese news agency, or Nikkei, has been reporting that he's under attack by retired Chinese leaders. No one else has reported this. There's no clear sign that this is happening, but at least the rumors are out there that he's being criticized for mismanaging things, whether it's the economy, whether it's COVID, whether it's relations with the developed West, and so on. But just to repeat, on many key issues, he's unwilling to bend, sort of stay the course. Things are going okay, things will get better. Okay. So in terms of political problems, intellectuals are alienated from the political system, or they choose to become toadies to it for careerist reasons. Young people are shocked that the implicit social contract of a better life in exchange for party control has seemed to dissolve before their eyes. There's been no unified reaction to that. This, of course, impacts their parents as well, who invested lots to have their kids prepare well for the Gaokao or the entrance exam for college, and see their efforts not paying out with anything. Some kids are just returning to live at home because they won't take low-paying, low-quality kinds of jobs. Technocrats within the government also know that problems are not being addressed. Their voices are not being heard. They know that fundamental or more substantial changes need to be done to get the economy working again. It would have to move away from the kind of strict controls that have been there under the last 4 or 5 years under Xi. Private entrepreneurs are trying to move their wealth, if not themselves, offshore. Growing numbers of Chinese intellectuals are migrating. There's a story in the New York Times today about that, because of the lack of freedom of Xi's growing autocracy, in their view, of more social welfare, not having to work the high-tech jobs that are summarized as 996. You work from 9 in the morning to 9 in the evening, 6 days a week, and sometimes more than that. Xi's judgment is being called into question, if quietly, among close friends, maybe among small numbers of people in the government itself. But one object that the government has been pursuing since 1989 in the crackdown on democracy movement was to make collective action of widespread mass protest difficult, which was partly why it was so shocking or so surprising that there was widespread protest back in November last year because of the inefficiencies of the COVID lockdowns. So these are the political problems. Okay. Xi and his subordinates have been making growing appeals to the global South, meaning Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Pacific Island countries. That China's Belt and Road Initiative to lead to greater connectivity among the global South turns 10 this year. There'll be a big forum in Beijing in November to talk about this. Meanwhile, Xi has rolled out what he calls the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. These are designed to create new norms in the international system. Global Development Initiative is one that calls about fairer, more equitable development, dealing with global debt issues. Global Security Initiative talks about constraints on the use of force, of all-round concerns for security. Global Civilization Initiative is perhaps the most, the sharpest one in terms of opposition to the current international norms, because it's basically saying sort of different cultures have different practices, that international human rights norms as identified by the US and the UN are not, in fact, universal, that each society has the right to choose its own values and that these should not be imposed on them. This has been followed up by a proposal China made just on the eve of the UN meeting last month for a proposal of the PRC on the reform and development of global governance, emphasizing UN reform and perhaps diluting the power of the Big Five, although I find it hard to believe that China would sacrifice its own veto power. They just put out a white paper called the Global Community of Shared Future, again, sort of attacking the norms and institutions that the US and Europe established after World War II. They're designed to contest these norms. China has not been very clear, however, about how what institutional manifestations these would take. It's not clear how these norms are supposed to get entrenched. It may be that this is going to reinforce moving towards a bipolar kind of world where the developed West, the democracies, will have one set of rules, and China and its friends in the developing world will have another. But how we get beyond these rather vague kind of proposals, and there are at a very high level of generality, so it's hard to see what's really going to come from these things, to trying to put them into practice. That's something the Chinese or anyone else has not sketched out. So this turn to the global South has lots of rhetoric, but not a lot of practical measures. We did see the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, add 6 new members: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Argentina, and Ethiopia to its group. But it's far from clear, so what? You add more members to it. What does this mean? What are they going to do? What's their agenda? How are they going to advance that agenda? None of that has really been spelled out. China proposes lots of China-led multilateral forums, but there's little institution building in a real sense. The only exception to this was China's creation of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The other ones have been largely meetings of leaders, discussions among top level officials, but no sort of sense of, are we going to act together? Are we going to coordinate our policies? Are we going to present a common front? How are we going to enforce this? Nothing like that. So you have this issue of how do you get from these proposals to actually challenge, replace Western created norms and institutions, both at the formal level of human rights in the Western sense, originating from inherent rights of the person, to international economic institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, and the informal elements of the current global order, the central role of the United States and of the US dollar. And we don't have good ideas, or they don't have good ideas yet about how to replace this. So China and the US. China and the US arguably see each other in increasingly hostile terms. And this is particularly true of US politicians and arguably of the US political class more generally. Each sees the other as their biggest international challenger, biggest impediment to the world moving in the direction they want it to go. Both, though, are looking for ways to try to manage these tensions and cooperate where it might make sense. On economic issues, at least some of them, education, maybe people-to-people ties, climate change, and so on. A limited dialogue seems to be emerging that top US cabinet officials have been traveling to China in recent months. Chinese cabinet level officials are beginning to reciprocate. But that process of meeting, of talking, of dialogue is not a substitute, or it won't substitute for substance. And the substantive issues have not really been advanced or addressed. And there would be a high political cost by the Biden administration to back down or change many of the current policies. Interests are seen by both sides as fundamentally incompatible. There's zero sum, whether it's about technology leadership, whether it's about Taiwan, whether human rights, whether it's a fundamental challenge to each country's sense of its national identity. As the Chinese say, there's no two suns in the heavens, no two emperors on the earth, that there has to be one number one top dog. And for the Chinese, that should be China. For the US, I think still for most, certainly American politicians, that should be the US. And figuring out how to manage two powerful countries is going to be a fundamental challenge for both societies. So where does that leave us? So we start with that famous philosopher, Y. Barra. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So some have been talking about, with China's current problems, a peak China has appeared, that it's gotten as close to its top position as it's going to get. This is going to be a challenge, according to some, that this may make China desperate to act within the next decade or so, but that the China challenge has essentially been met. And China's own internal contradictions are going to increasingly weaken it. And so that the China problem, if we can get through the next decade or so, is going to go away and the United States can remain the dominant country in the world, or so some would have us believe. Relatedly, some might argue that because of domestic distress, China might engage in what political scientists call a diversionary war, to try to invade Taiwan, to take over Taiwan, first to solve perhaps its lack of access to the highest technology, microchips, but also to complete the Chinese nationalist claim to unite all Chinese under the banner of the People's Republic of China. People make arguments. I mean, obviously, this is hypothetical at this point, China has made no bones, though, and you've probably heard this in the Taiwan talk, about seeing Taiwan as part of the PRC and ultimately unification, or as the PRC puts it, reunification has to take place. Whether that's through force or other means is not entirely clear. Oops, sorry. So that's a possibility. Certainly, one can make an argument that China needs more fundamental economic reforms, if not social reforms, political reforms, to open up things, to stimulate the private sector, to not benefit solely the state sector, to move away from investment-driven economic activity to a more consumption-oriented economy, to build up social welfare, to cut back on the censorship and control of information. One could argue as well, there might be a fundamental challenge from below. If unemployment continues to grow, if more and more people see this implicit social contract being broken, if the party seems unresponsive to the people's plight, but how that comes about, again, given the barriers to collective action of working together, to coordinating not just in one place, but across the country, the system is designed to prevent that from happening. Or the system might just muddle through by hanging tough, by sort of doing minimally what needs to be done. And so, I've been studying China now for almost 50 years. I could put down arbitrary odds attached to each one of these scenarios. Unfortunately, I think the last scenario probably has the highest probability in terms of what happens next year. But nonetheless, if the US self-destructs and China doesn't face some of the kinds of challenges it might be facing. And with that, I will stop talking. I think